Well, when I thought about it as I was preparing this outline, I realized that I've been calling myself a socialist for a full half a century. So I kind of came to this out of the New Left. The New Left, among other things, was an intellectual movement designed to prize Marx out of the grip of Soviet orthodoxy, orthodox Marxism-Leninism. And there was a great emphasis on Marx's early writings. And back in the late 60s, I studied those in some detail, and I thought, boy, these are some cool ideas. So ever since then, I've been calling myself a socialist. Marx mainly in his early writings talked about communism, but I was very, very hesitant to say, oh, I'm a communist, because you never know what people will think about that. For that matter, you never know what people are going to think when you say you're a socialist. So that's become a little bit more respectable right now on account of Bernie Sanders. A little factoid that I picked up in Harper's Magazine, now 1 out of 4 men between the ages of 25 and 34 consider themselves to be socialists. 1 in 8 women between those ages consider themselves to be socialists. I have no idea what they mean by that, but it'd be interesting to see. But I'd like to explain what I mean by that and what I found attractive about Marx's early writings and those kinds of things. Let me get the bearings, give you some bearings to start out with. Socialism, like almost all our modern ideologies, originated in the French Revolution. And it's been very diverse over the years. There have been some false starts in different directions. For example, early on, there were attempts to establish socialist communities, most of which failed. And the idea was that once those were established, other people would emulate them, and that's how socialism would come about. And it didn't work. So from the time of the French Revolution up until World War I, there was kind of a unified socialist communist movement. That broke apart in connection with World War I. Lenin and Marxist-Leninists opposed World War I, and they took a very firm position against it. A lot of other socialists went along with it, basically, supported their governments. They became social democrats, and Lenin and his followers became communists, as they called themselves, and that's what most of us mean by communists. I like to use the phrase Marxist-Leninist to describe them. Marxism-Leninism wound up, that was a dead end too, I think. Lenin and his followers wound up establishing militaristic police states, which, who would want to live there? Who would want to live in Russia, for heaven's sakes? And the Social Democrats wound up establishing welfare states, the most obvious of those being Sweden and Germany. So the heretofore unified socialist tradition split dramatically at the time of World War I. And I want to capture one strand. I'm not purporting to define socialism or lay down any kind of orthodoxy, but I want to try to grab one strand of this thinking, of this tradition, that is based upon Marx's early writings, and I'm going to be talking quite a bit about that. In his early days, Marx wrote mainly philosophical type stuff. He was what was called a young Hegelian. Hegel dominated thought in Germany, philosophy in Germany, for quite some time, and there were many young Hegelians, Marx among them, who picked up various strands of Hegel and developed them. In general, there was a left interpretation, that's Marx and the guys, and a right interpretation, right-wing interpretation of Hegel. And they fought happily with one another. In Marx's early writings, you will find a conception of socialist society. Actually, Marx talks about communism all the time, but as I've explained, I'm shying away from that term. A socialist society is one that puts the interests of producers first. I use the word producers rather than workers because workers tends to conjure up factory workers, industrial laborers, and things like that, who are now, about 10% of the labor force and ever declining as technology and automation goes forward. So producers is a more general term, and I use it to mean anyone who makes something or performs a service that satisfies the needs, wants, and desires, or if you prefer the utility, confers utility upon other people. That's what it means to be a producer. All kinds of people are producers. I was a lawyer, for heaven's sakes, and I think I was a producer at the time. You know, I tended to produce resolution of conflicts and things like that. Hard to put a value on, but unlike a commodity. But, you know, doctors, scientists, intellectual workers of all different kinds are producers. Even people who own businesses who you might otherwise call capitalists are producers. For example, this may be heretical, but I think of Bill Gates, someone like Bill Gates, as a producer. He produces an awful lot of stuff and creates an awful lot of jobs and other people, and he's satisfying other people's needs, wants, and desires. So, I like to use, I've tested this out, I've been calling myself a socialist for years and years, for half a century now, and almost never does somebody say, okay, wise guy, what would you do? So, and I kind of test out people's views. I'm never sure what people hear when I say, oh, I'm a socialist. Whether they think I'm, you know, like a follower of Lenin, who is going to try to nationalize everything and institute state planning and all of that kind of stuff. History demonstrates that stuff just does not work. I use a little phrase that I like, that I try out on people all the time. And it goes as follows. It says, the interests of working people come first because everything else depends upon them. And I find when I try that out on people, that people who consider themselves conservatives or will call themselves conservatives are more likely to agree with that than people who call themselves liberals. I tend, with people who call themselves liberals, when I spring that phrase on them, they tend to say, but what about fill in the blank as you choose, some preferred constituency of one. What about the disabled? What about the homeless? What about? So my big project here is to try to find some terms for public discourse which transcend the utterly stale dialogue or controversy that we have going on in this society between liberals and conservatives. And I'll touch on some of the points in which I think that is an utter dead end, and we need to start thinking about these things in some broader terms. I hope to introduce you to a whole different way of thinking about a lot of stuff. There was an old slogan that popped up at the time of the Russian Revolution. Before Lenin and the Bolsheviks staged their coup, there were spontaneous uprisings all over Russia. The army had fallen apart, so there were lots of mustered out soldiers, handy to have around if you want to take power and things. And there were spontaneous uprisings in rural areas, but most importantly in cities, involving trade unions, soldiers, and people like that. And one of their slogans, which I've always kind of liked, is all power to the producers. So I don't know the Russian, but so that's a slogan, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that might mean. Answer the question of, okay, wise guy, what are you going to do? A socialist society is one in which producers flourish. There is abundance, and there are substantial advances in science and technology that liberate people from the necessity of drudgery. So, ideally, in Marx's conception of things, and he's talking about, he uses the phrase communism, not socialism. Marx envisions communism as a society of self-determining individuals in which true individuality, that's pretty much a direct quote from him, flourishes. This is a long way away from the dreary police states that we see calling themselves communists these days. Now, Marx, and I'm talking about his early writings here, Marx made some major mistakes in some of his later writings. The biggest one of which is Marx believed he had discovered a law which made it inevitable that capitalist economies would collapse. That proved not to be true, obviously. And I was in a seminar once with a bunch of economists and other social scientists and philosophers and went through some of his writings, and the economist types convinced me that it was wrong logically from the get-go. I don't remember the details of that. Marx did get his finger, in later writings, did get his finger on some important trends in capitalism. For example, he anticipated globalization, concentration and centralization of capital, a rising of vast financial institutions which control huge assets and things like that. But his core belief that it was inevitable, it was a law of nature, basically, that capitalism would destroy itself, proved not to be true, and proved to take a lot of things in a bad direction, I think. The second big mistake that Marx made, I think, is underestimating the power of democracy. You may have heard a quote from Marx that the state is but the executive committee of the bourgeoisie. And Marx viewed the state and democratic societies as basically being committees controlled by capitalists and the bourgeoisie. And he was wrong about that. In fact, democracy has brought about many of the changes that Marx talked about in some of his writings. I used to teach a lecture course at Ohio State on political ideologies, and one of my favorite lectures was to take the Communist Manifesto written by Marx and Engels in 1848, which was a year of revolution in Europe. And at the end of that, Marx lists 10 things that he thinks are applicable things, good steps to take in the current circumstances. Among those are things like the abolition of child labor, institution of the 10-hour day, and elimination of female labor. Up until World War II, most progressives wanted women out of the labor force, did not want them to have to be a necessity of that, not to have the necessity of labor. The idea being that that supported families, and that the family was a good and important institution. So from my point of view, when it's not inevitable capitalism is going to collapse, and democratic processes have resulted in an awful lot of domestication of capitalism. A lot of the rough edges have been taken off by the institution of things like unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, Social Security, et cetera, et cetera. And those policies got through by democratic means, basically, although they faced very substantial opposition from a variety of folks. So you might say that I think of Marx's early writings as kind of prefiguring a sort of ethical Marxism. That is, that they articulate an ideal of a society in which producers flourish and individuals are self-determining. I'll talk a little bit about what those things mean in a bit. And make a case for trying to progress toward that society. Marx held a lot of people who tried to gin up super detailed plans about how society was supposed to work, who picked up the garbage and all that kind of stuff, and called them utopian socialists. He thought that was an utter waste of time. I kind of think that's an utter waste of time too, conjuring up ideal societies and trying to sell them. Marx thought of communism as the real trend in things. And I'd like to advocate that thought. Well, how do we get there? What would we mean? Okay, wise guy, what would you do now that you're calling yourself a socialist? And I think there are two fundamental strategies that we need to pursue. One is to build a truly productive society. Marx says in one of his early writings, if man is by nature a social being, he only develops his real nature in society, and the power of his nature should be measured not by the power of private individuals, but by the power of society. Now, what on earth does that mean? To me, that means that I'm having trouble reading my notes in this light. To me, that means, in the first instance, that we have to change the way we think about government accounting. Oh, boring, right? Government accounting is now receipts and disbursement accounting. Money comes in, money goes out, and everything that goes out is just a disbursement. If you don't have enough money that comes in to cover what's going out, then you engage in deficit financing and incur debt. You know, governments sell bonds to bondholders in order to raise the money to cover the shortfall. And there's a great debate in American society about how much public deficit, how much public debt is too much. I think that is an utterly unproductive debate, and it hasn't really resolved anything. And I think what's really wrong here is that what's missing from the picture here of this accounting is they don't have a category of capital expenditures or capital investment. Private businesses have balance sheets, and they have assets, liabilities, and equity. And some government expenditures, I'm going to use education as an example in just a minute, do create capital assets. In the case of education, that happens to be in the form of human capital. Those are assets of society. And one of the basic things I think we ought to start thinking about and doing is to try to enhance the balance sheet of society. I think that's what Marx means by talking about the power of society. That is to say, we should adopt policies that result in capital investments. These are mostly investments in people. And education is a primary example. Well, there's little question in my mind that we underfund education. We underinvest in education quite a bit. And I think a solution to this problem would be to start viewing expenditures for education as capital investments. The public puts up money, and think of it as an investment, and like any investment, they should get a return on their investment. Now, how might that work in the case of education? In the case of education, I'm just going to talk about post-secondary education here for the time being. In the case of education, I maintain that that ought to all be publicly financed in the form of payments to people that will allow them to get additional training. But those individuals should not capture all the fruits of that. Instead, they should have to agree that over their working lifetime, they will pay back a certain percentage of their income to the people who lent this money to them in the first place. That's us, that's the public, all of us. And I imagine this would be run through a government agency. So basically the way it would work is that you would apply for funding, an individual would apply for funding to go to college and convince this agency, which has a fund of money, that they're a good bet, they're a good investment, and as part of the negotiation, this would be negotiated on a case-by-case basis, as part of the negotiation, they would agree to pay a certain percentage of their income. And the law should charge this agency with trying to make some money. That money ought to go back into the pot to pay for the education of the next generation of workers that come along. Now, Bernie Sanders had offered a proposal about free college education and getting rid of student debt and that kind of thing. And I heard an awfully lot of people criticize that. Oh, that's just a big giveaway program. And I learned quickly how to shut them up. The way to shut them up is, what's so wrong about investing in the next generation of workers? That shuts them up effectively. People claim this is just a giveaway. So we should conceive, in my view, socialist point of view, we should conceive of society as a whole as a productive enterprise that has its own balance sheet, its own equity, and so on, and try to adopt policies that enhance the equity of society so that there is more money around, there's positive assets that can be used for things like education. And we want to think of them as investments. So the public, that's all of us, are putting money into things, that should not go just to the benefit of individuals, but should benefit society too. That is all the rest of us. And that would be the payback on, that people would agree to make as a condition of having their advanced education funded. I assume, quite frankly, that there would be a lot of areas of things where an agency like that, a lot of lines of study that I think things that have studies in their name are not going to do too well in this particular process. Whereas things like science, technology, engineering, and mathematics and things like that are going to do fairly well in this process. But we want to make society powerful. So we want to put our social investments in areas where they will bear fruit and produce returns for us. So that is one prong, that is one strategy that I think we need to think about here. I keep track of the time. Damn that thing. Excuse me while I get my watch off. God damn that thing. I was up at 4 o'clock this morning. I've had about 10 cups of coffee already today. If I sound a little edgy, that's why. So one strategy that I think socialists ought to be thinking about is building a productive society, thinking of society itself as a productive enterprise in which we are all involved, and think of it in terms of making money for society, that is, for all of us. The other big strategy I think is extremely important is to minimize the impact of free riders. Free riders is originally a term from labor economics, and it referred to people who wanted to get the benefits that a union provided, such as grievance procedures, perhaps higher wages, fringe benefits, and those kinds of things, without paying any dues to the union. They were free riding on that. It's a big problem in labor economics. So that's where the term originally came from, but it has an awful lot more application than that these days. Other people talk about free riders. Conservative economists and things like that tend to talk these days about free riders as rent seekers. That is, people who want to grab an interest in something and just collect rents, collect income. Now, there's an interesting foundation for this, and I'm going to give you a couple examples of free riders, but I want to read a little passage from a very interesting book by a guy named Matthew Ricard, who is a Zen Buddhist monk, as well as a biologist and a neuroscientist. Pretty interesting character, and he talks about some things in evolutionary theory that have been going on, some mathematical modeling that I think bears on this particular kind of point. And I can't say it better than he does, so I will just do that. It turns out, in fact, says Ricard, that human societies can be described in terms of collections of people who share certain interests, values, and activities. The more points you have in common with others, the more you will interact with them, and the more your shared interests will encourage you to cooperate. Ricard, the biologist types have shown that in animal communities, when you have groups competing with one another, and basically all social animals compete with one another on a group basis, human beings in their own societies compete with other societies on a group basis. And what this evolutionary theory has said is that societies that have higher levels of cooperation, of altruistic behavior, of people who do things for the sake of benefiting other people, in fact outcompete. And evolutionary theory, that means have more offspring than societies with lower levels of cooperation. And that's kind of an idea near and dear to my heart. But Ricard writes, the eternal problem in a community of cooperating individuals is the presence of profiteers, whom economists call free riders, who profit from the kindness of cooperators in order to use them and get the best of the deal. When the majority of people trust each other and cooperate, free riders can easily exploit others. And when their number increases too much, the community declines. These mathematical models that go on say that there's kind of appears to be a critical point that when 20% of a population of animals, in this case, are cooperators, they display altruistic behavior, then the community grows stronger, they have more offspring, and they outcompete other groups or other communities that do not have as many cooperators in them. So, we are social animals. Marx talks about that all the time. And what that means, I think, there are lots and lots of social animals, ranging from insects, to birds, mammals of all kinds, up to primates, and up to us, Homo sapiens. And all social animals do certain things. One, they develop specialized functions. Two, they create hierarchies. Three, they establish territories. And four, they exhibit altruistic behavior. And that's true across the board. The more, what some of this biology stuff shows is the more altruistic behavior there is within a group, the more that group prospers and competes successfully against groups that have less altruistic behavior. So a lot of the point here, the point of the exercise is to encourage altruistic behavior. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas here. And the game plan here is to find ways to control and minimize free riding. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of free riding that might not strike you right off the bat. You might think I'm talking about welfare recipients and stuff like that. But I think the concept of free riding goes an awful lot further than that. Let me spin one little thing. I picked up an article a while ago. I'm an avid reader of Scientific American, and from time to time they put out a little special report on things. And this particular one turns out to be a new cancer therapy that tries to re-engineer your body's T cells so that it will attack cancers. It has tremendous promise. And it went through a whole series of trials and studies and things like that. I'm going to assume for the sake of discussion this article doesn't say so, but those studies and clinical trials that started it all off were funded publicly. I'm going to assume, and I think this is true of most of these cases, that it was grants from the National Institute, organizations like the National Institute of Health, which we pay for, it's public investment, underwrite this initial stuff. And this article says, until these early trials succeeded, drug companies basically hadn't invested a dime in CAR T development. In 2012, however, Novartis inked a deal with the University of Pennsylvania to commercialize its technologies. Now, what this represents in my mind is the private appropriation of socially produced knowledge. The basic concepts are proven through public funding, and then after that point, the pharmaceutical business gets into it. And of course, they do a lot of stuff. The whole testing process and approval process for drugs is no small thing. But nevertheless, they are enjoying the fruits of socially produced knowledge. And they ought to pay for it. That's a form of free riding, quite frankly. You might not think of that as being free riding, but it is. They're taking things that were produced socially by cooperative individuals and privately appropriating them. And often case, if this therapy is successful, somebody's going to make one whole hell of a bunch of money. So what we should do then, I think, the cure for this particular kind of free riding would be as follows. That we would require the Novartises, the pharmaceutical companies who pick up and base their work upon these upon this socially produced knowledge, to pay for it. And here's how that could work. We would require a company to reach a negotiated agreement with a public agency that's charged with getting a fair return on the public's investment in the production of scientific knowledge before they can finalize or obtain a patent. And that would put real teeth into it. So in other words, in order for Novartis to get a patent on this new cancer technology, they would have to reach a settlement with a public agency, which I assume would be staffed with lots of boring economists and accounting types, where they pay fair value for the knowledge that they're drawing upon here. And that, in this particular case, effectively stops free riding. Another example of free riding that I want to talk about just a little bit involves the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare if you prefer. In this country, both federal laws and state laws, I know for a fact Wisconsin law says this, I don't know about Minnesota, didn't practice here, have requirements that any hospital or any chartered hospital, or in the case of the federal law, any hospital that receives substantial federal funds, and in the age of Medicare and Medicaid, that's virtually all hospitals, right? That they must provide emergency care to anybody who falls across the threshold of the emergency room. And there are a lot of people, I live around many of them and talk to them about this kind of stuff, for whom that is their health care planning. That is, they just count on when they have a serious injury, in the case of a friend of mine, have a heart attack, that they can get into the emergency room and then get care. Hospitals are prohibited from discharging somebody out of their care if they don't have someplace safe to send them. That's another aspect of this particular rule. So we are providing all kinds of free care to people who are frankly free riding on things. The Affordable Care Act was designed to change that. It was designed to eliminate free riding in health care. And the way it did that was the so-called individual mandate. That is, people were required to obtain health insurance, and they were going to create a marketplace of health insurance, or they would pay a substantial tax penalty. Well, by the time that got through Congress, the tax penalty got so weak that nobody thought it would be an effective way of having people who didn't want to buy health insurance, who thought they can just get all the emergency care they need, from doing it, from buying this stuff. So that didn't work. The studies that Congress did in preparation for the Affordable Care Act concluded, this is done by economists, that about 15% of the medical bill that you pay is there to compensate the hospital for free care that it has to provide. So we all pay more. Us folks who have insurance or have the means to pay for our own health care, we all pay substantially more to pick up the tab for free riders. And the Affordable Care Act was on the right track with that. That was requiring people to have insurance. It's pretty rare that for major things people can pay for their own health care out of their own resources. Some can, but not very many. So as a practical matter, it means having insurance these days. And the original idea of the Affordable Care Act of compelling people to have insurance was a sound one, and it would eliminate the free riding in this particular thing, and would eventually cause all of us to have 15% lower medical bills, something that I would like. So sooner or later, now here comes the hard talk. Sooner or later, we have to adopt a policy that says if you show up in an emergency room and you don't have health insurance, they can turn you away. They do not have to provide you with free care. Now that may be hard on some people, but I think when the word got around pretty quickly, people would stop doing that and would see an additional reason to buy insurance and bear their fair share of the costs of health care. So when you start looking for it, you can see free riding all over the place. In this case, uninsured individuals are free riding on all the rest of us. And I have known people who have gotten into a hospital. A friend of mine had a heart attack. He never had health insurance. He made as much money as I did, but he drank it all up, and bought big fancy pickup trucks, which I have no use for. But he wound up going to an emergency room, and then after that spending 10 days in a cardiac intensive care unit. I have no idea how many tens of thousands of dollars that cost, but it cost all the rest of us. And he wound up not having to pay anything for that care because he had spent all his money and was able to convince, in this particular case, it was Essentia Health, that he didn't have anything. So he couldn't even agree with the payment plan, and paid essentially nothing, got free care. That kind of stuff needs to stop. And even though he's a friend of mine, I don't approve of what he's done here. So deterring free riding benefits society, and it benefits the people who are the productive people who play by the rules and those kinds of things, and that sort of thing. And that's a good, sound socialist policy, I think, and something that we ought to start pursuing in this society. Now, I'd like to turn now to a little bit different topic, and that's some thoughts on equality. Equality is becoming a big deal. It's very much in the air these days. But I'm very disappointed in the things that I'm seeing about it. I've searched very hard for somebody who would write a thoughtful article about what equality is, why is it good, and what measures should we take in order to achieve equality. I want to say that equality is a false god, and we shouldn't spend a lot of time chasing it. We also hear an argument all the time that says, well, women's average income is less than men's average income. That has to be changed. That's something wrong, and we need to eliminate that. Ultimately, that logic leads, if you chase that logic far enough, it leads to the idea that everybody ought to have the same. Everybody ought to have the same income. Everybody ought to have, in some cases, people will say people ought to have the same assets and the same wealth. This has very little to do with Marx, and in the early Marx that I'm talking about here. Marx's attitude about this is that people are different, so they shouldn't all be the same or have the same. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are more motivated than others. It's perfectly natural and okay that those people should get more income than the people who aren't. If you've spent your life smoking pot and drinking beer and stuff, which I know many people who live around me who do that, then you're not entitled to as much as some diligent Asian student who has gotten advanced degrees and so on. You shouldn't be paid the same as that particular person. Marx, in his economic philosophic manuscripts, has a long discussion of what he calls crude communism. And one possible reading of this is a stage society had to go to get to real full communism. That's not my reading. My reading is Marx was a Hegelian then. I think he's talking about the idea of communism here. Crude communism is a state of affairs where there is equality of wages, and those wages are paid out by the community. In this situation, Marx says the community is acting as the capitalist, and everybody is a worker, and they get the same wages. Now, about this society, Marx says that it winds up trying to eliminate all talent by force. That's not a good thing. He also says that it really represents just the culmination of envy. It does not transcend private property, or Marx would say in a more Hegelian mood. It just universalizes private property so that everybody kind of gets the same wage and is stuck in the same thing. Finally, Marx says that crude communism, quote, negates the personality of man in every sphere. That is to say, personality is a technical term from Hegelian philosophy. It means really moral autonomy. And so this is damning what he calls crude communism. Communism that tries to impose equality of wages. Kind of wish Doran was here. I'd like to see what he has to say about this. And basically what Marx is saying in his writings here is that crude communism, the enforcing equality, leads to totalitarianism. Well, what's different about real communism? Marx says in Hegelian stuff that real communism is the positive supersession of private property. Well, what on earth does that mean? He is envisioning a society in which each of us asks of ourselves, what is enough for me to have a self-determining life? That is, what is enough for me to have the ability to make my own life story? Now, some material basis is needed for that. If you're desperately poor, you can't start even thinking about that. But it's really not a matter of equality, or in many cases, how much money you have. There's a ton of research on happiness and stuff, which shows for the most part that after a certain point, additional money does not make people happier. And here about happiness, we're talking about subjective well-being. You know, you ask people questions, psychologists ask them questions about how's life going, that kind of thing, and they're positive or negative, and put them all on scales and that kind of stuff. After a certain point, money, up to a certain point, money does give you more happiness because it allows you to do more things, but after a certain point, it drops off and there's no additional gain. And there's good evidence for that particular thing. So, what if I were to say to you, I can't have a good life because Bill Gates has more money than I do? What would you say about such a person? Well, I'd say get a life. Stop worrying about Bill Gates. I mean, Bill Gates has got a lot more money than I do, but I feel that I have enough to have a good life. And it doesn't matter to me how much Bill Gates has. It doesn't matter to me how much anybody else has. I'm not thinking in terms of equality. I am thinking in terms of my own ability to determine my own life. And that is Marx's basic idea of what real communism is all about. Real communism is a society of self-determining producers. And we move toward that by getting a return on social investments and by constraining or controlling free riding. So the best solution I can come up with along these fronts is that we ought to have, and I'm an advocate of, a universal basic income that everybody gets. I don't know the amount of that at all. And I think a lot of the public discussion of that is really misleading and shallow. I've read things by conservatives who are criticizing this, who say, oh, this is way too expensive to ever afford. And how do they arrive at that conclusion? They take the amount that would be paid. $10,000 seems to be the figure that's thrown around a lot these days. I don't know if that has any real foundation or not. And multiply it by the number of people in the population. Of course, you get a fantastic number. It's trillions and trillions of dollars. Say, we can't afford that. Well, what's wrong with that reasoning? What's wrong with that reasoning is that if we did institute a universal basic income, lots of things that we have now and pay for could be eliminated or dramatically downgraded. For example, if there was a universal basic income, we would not need as much unemployment compensation as we do now. We would not need temporary total benefits under workers' compensation and things like that. There would be great substantial savings. And how this all comes out in the wash, I'm just not sure. And I'm very disappointed that very few people seem to pay a lot of attention to this. So, and the public discussion of a universal basic income is, I think, another one of those cases where the controversy, the dialogue between conservatives and liberals is just basically pointless. So, universal basic income, and then beyond that, producers produce what they are, and to the greatest extent possible, they should be allowed to retain the fruits of their production. And that means that free riders, you can't have people free riding on producers. We want to avoid that particular situation. So, for example, if I were dictator in charge of things, sorry, John, I'm going to be cosmic dictator right now, and I've just got to dictate all these policies. As I say, I don't know what the number would be, but it ought to be what we can afford. Well, what does that mean, that we can afford? It means that no productive person, no producer should be put in a position where they lack the ability to have a good life. It shouldn't be set that high that people who are going to have to be paying for this particular thing are driven to a situation where they no longer have a self-determining life. And if I were dictator in charge of it, I would put an exception to the general rule of a universal basic income that says basically that that persons who could work or can work but don't without good cause don't get it. Now, we got a ton of law about ability to work and all that stuff under our Social Security disability system. There, the concept is, you're not disabled if you're capable of you're capable of performing substantial gainful employment. The standard one that the administrative law judges always ask clients, and I've been in a number of these hearings, is could you work as a ticket taker in a parking lot? And if you can do that, you are capable of substantial gainful employment. And if you are capable of that and do not do it, you don't get the universal basic income. So that's a limitation on the universality of it. As far as I can figure out, that's the best solution to this whole thing and this whole network, whole knot mess of issues raised about equality and so on. I think is the best way we can deal with it. So, in summary here, socialist society is one that puts the interests of producers first. And it does that primarily by making society productive. That's the education investments that I was talking about here. And by controlling free riders. So the pharmaceutical industries, the uninsured people and so on should pay their own way, not be allowed to free ride or mooch off of the rest of us. That's unfair to the producers, productive people. This is all right out of Marx, by the way. People often think, well, Marx believed everybody ought to be the same and there ought to be strict equality and so on and so on. No, he didn't. And it's that aspect of Marx that I found very attractive and kind of led me to start calling myself a socialist. So, because those are the things that I would like to see happening in this society.
Thank you very much, sir. It was very informative and gives us something to think about and talk about.